Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. And a great thank you also to the Ukrainian Leadership Academy, our amazing partner that is doing this event together with us today. Am I speaking slowly enough, Gennady? All good? Great. So I would like firstly to welcome all of you to this very important event entitled Building Ukraine Beyond and After the War, Lessons from Global Experiences, Ukraine, and the Pivotal Role of Youth. And before anything else, I would like to remind everyone that simultaneous translation in Ukrainian is available. So you can access it by clicking on interpretation and choosing the channel that you would like to listen to. My name is Laura Pistarini, and I am a program manager at Patrir, the Romanian Peace Institute, and I will be facilitating today's event. And this webinar is part of Peace Support Ukraine's, a project funded by the Soka Gakkai Buddhist Institute in Italy. And it aims to support Ukrainian experts, civil society, activists, and youth to address the priorities they identify, have their voices heard internationally, and to create opportunities for Ukrainian citizens to build hope for their future and the positive change that they wish to see in their lives, both during and after the war. So Ukraine, as many countries in the world today, is living through occupation, armed violence, and terrible destruction. Lives have been lost, millions of people have been displaced, both inside and outside Ukraine, and relevant infrastructure is still under attack. And for a year now, we have millions of people in the European continent living with the daily experience of war and occupation every day for 367 days. This is the worst war in Europe since the Second World War. So this is not simply an event. We wanted to bring together a space for discussion and to address the impacts of the invasion, the occupation, and war in Ukraine on Ukraine's people, society, economy, and more. But also to focus on what we can do and what will need to be done to build Ukraine and recover it beyond the war. So today's conversation will revolve around the concrete challenges, as well as the lessons learned and good practices in the field of post-war recovery and stabilization. And to do this today with us, we have two amazing speakers to guide us through this discussion. That is Dr. Maria Levchenko and Kai Bren Jacobsen. And I will introduce briefly the speakers. You know both of them, but still, Dr. Maria Levchenko is a McCain Global Fellow 2022, Peace Building Officer at the Romanian Peace Institute, my colleague, very proud to say that, and European Director of Outreach and Training at the River Phoenix Center for Peace Building. She also works as a researcher for the United States Institute of Peace and the Berghoff Foundation on topic of national dialogue and its perspectives in the post-war context. In the past, she worked as a dialogue facilitation officer at the OSCE. Maria is a graduate for the Community Leadership Institute at George Mason University and a Champion Scholarship Awardee in 2019-2020. And in her work, she educates young people, refugees, and women on themes of civic dialogue and peace building and fighting propaganda, disinformation, and extremism. She implements social and emotional learning throughout her education. And her specific expertise revolves around dialogue programs, facilitation, awareness raising, conflict resolution, and trauma healing. We also have Kai Bren Jacobsen with us, who is widely regarded as one of the leading practitioners in the field of peace building and recovery after war in the world today. For more than 25 years, he has worked in the invitation of governments, communities, the United Nations, and others to support peace and recovery. He is a senior trainer for the International Peace and Development Training Center and has provided more than 400 training and executive leadership programs for governments, UN missions and agencies, and organizations in the field. In 2019, he was awarded the Mahatma Gandhi Martin Luther King Jr. Ikeda Lifetime Achievement Award for extraordinary contributions to humanity. His work is one of the subjects of the recent documentary movie called In Pursuit of Peace. And since February 2022, he has been the CEO of the All Ukraine Global Humanitarian Response and Refugee Support. So I have spoken way too much, but just to outline the agenda for today, we will have first the intervention of Dr. Maria Levchenko, then the intervention of Kai Brain Jacobson, and finally we'll have a facilitated discussions between everybody, both the speakers and the participants. So with that said, Maria, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. I'll just remind one more time in Ukrainian that we have a translation for those who just joined. Доброго вечора всім. На сьогодні є переклад на українську мову. Якщо ви подивитеся внизу зума, там є така кнопочка, яка схожа на глобус. Якщо ви на неї натиснете і виберете українську мову, у вас буде переклад українською мовою. Тому, якщо вам буде зручніше, тому що сьогодні ми будемо говорити на англійській. Okay, so switching back to English, just to give a small instruction on how to use the translation option today. And I will be starting my presentation. I'll try to keep it short, just because I want to provide space and time for you to ask the questions and maybe share your reflections with us, but also for Kai's presentation after mine. And with that being said, let me know if you can see my presentation. Yep, all right. Mm-hmm. So today we'll be talking, as Laura already mentioned, in how to build Ukraine beyond and after the war, and what we can draw upon the global experiences Ukraine and how use, in particular use as from Ukrainian Leadership Academy, those young people that I have already met in the past year can play a vital role and can play a role in shaping the new reality and new identity of Ukraine on the global world arena. But before we're actually going to go into the case studies, I wanted to ask you, is after the war before the war? So when is after the war actually happening? Is after the war happening when we have signed up all the peaceful agreements, we have already stopped the fighting, we have already done everything we could in our power to prevent human life losing? When is it the after the war happening? And usually after the war and term post-conflict is very misleading, because there might not be true endpoint to a violent conflict. How do we measure it? How do we measure people who keep suffering from PTSD even 10 years after the war ended? The peaceful agreements, they sometimes do not resolve the goals of contending parties. And the examples of that are Northern Ireland and Bosnia and Herzegovina, where they had peaceful agreements, but it really did not bring peace until the people started to unite in the communities together. So yes, peaceful agreements can provide a framework where conflict parties can sit together and discuss, but at the same time, they do not guarantee that the peace will be achieved. And peaceful agreements sometimes might hold, but usually the average lifespan of a peaceful agreement can be 40 years, 30 years, and then it can be broken up very easily. And conflict can take both violent and non-violent forms. And conflict exists in all the societies at all the times. So the question here is, how do we measure it? And when do we start working towards the peace? And the answer to that, as we believe in peace building field, that we start already now. We don't wait till the end of the war. We don't wait to sign in the peaceful agreements. We start now at this exact moment. And it's really important to remember and take into account. So one of the most common items on the peace building agenda that usually is being implemented, whether before the war or after the war, is first of all, of course, demobilization of the soldiers, trying to reintegrate the soldiers into the peaceful life, trying to work with their traumas, with the impact of the war, demining the territory, and again, looking back into the territory of Ukraine, Right now, it's one of the most mine-infested territories in the world, unfortunately, and it will take up to 30 years to demine the territory of Ukraine. Then we are talking about disarmament, trying to get rid of the weapons, and Ukraine again accumulated a huge number of weapons, both in the hands of civilians, but also in the army. And it's, of course, establishment of the framework that I have been showing in the previous slide. How the civilian police forces will work? How do we rebuild the infrastructure? How there's the rule of law, and we also fight the corruption which always exists in all the societies. How do we build the institutions which really assure that this process is being transparent and everyone is being involved? How do we educate the people? How do we work on capacity building? And of course, one of the most important is psychosocial healing, because the whole social fabric of the society is being destroyed by the war. People are impacted deeply. People are impacted on many levels. Young people are impacted deeply. So that's something that the peace building agenda has at its core. And it's always throughout the whole structure when we are talking about how do we implement the peace building activities. Some of the peace building standards, and bear with me on a little bit of boring stuff here. I promise I'll go more into the case studies soon enough. But the Security Council, UN Security Councils, says that peace building requires short and long-term actions. In particular, if you're talking about sustainable peace, it's working on poverty inequalities, transparent and accountable governments, promotion of democracy, respect of human rights, rule of law, and promotion of culture of peace or nonviolence. Because violence is a cycle. Once we enter this cycle, it's very hard to get out of it. So we have to educate each other in how to solve the conflicts in a peaceful way. And positive peace can be achieved where human rights are protected and where sustained progress can be made towards the development. So here it's again this question about sustainability in protecting human rights and creating conditions for the peace to strive. Some of the three priorities in sustaining peace for a long time, whether during or after the war, it's to overcome or minimize the threat of spoilers. And by spoilers, I mean those actors who are not interested in sustaining the peace or supporting the peace. Second is demobilizing soldiers and reintegrating them into civilian life. But what we can also add here is supporting the IDPs, supporting the refugees for their reintegration into the civil life, into the life of the country that they have left. And of course, that's to lay foundations for future long-term peace building, reform the police, wider disarmament in the society, and building local capacities for human rights and reconciliation. And in this building local capacities for human rights and reconciliation, this is where the youth comes and plays a huge role, just because the youth is an agent of change. The youth is driving force to all the changes happen on all the levels. Either we start from the lowest level within the society or going up the top. Some of the case studies that I wanted to introduce here today, and I have only 3 for now. It's a case study of Colombia, where the international NGO was pushing for peace and was pushing for youth involvement in the agenda. So UNICEF was trying to build capacities of children and also youth to actively participate in peace building throughout different methodologies and campaigns. For example, they had campaigns via peace to youth, and peace in time. And also UNICEF in Colombia was implementing project towards reconciliation and peace building. So they were reintegrating girls and boys from non-state armed groups back into the society. And that really helped them to develop life projects, to have access to comprehensive reparations programs, but it also really encouraged their participation in reconciliation and peace building. So they took this group, which was very vulnerable, which was very much impacted by the conflict, and they allowed them to prosper and have opportunities to actually participate in the peace processes. The other case studies is a case studies from Myanmar, where youth was pushing actually actively for peace throughout their projects. So youth was the driving force behind everything. They have created their own platform in which they wanted to engage on youth issues and to promote their perspectives in national policy processes. And this active involvement in peace building was widely recognized by the government, who actually formed the National Youth Alliance and allowed youth to take a seat at the UN Peace Conference, which was called the 21st Century Panlong Conference. But youth was specifically that actor who pushed for inclusion and who pushed to be the active participant in the peace processes. And the last case studies is a cooperation with the government from Zimbabwe, where there was both desire from the youth to participate in the process, but also national government was really supporting them. So they have established this called Peace Building Initiative, National Youth Development Trust, where youth was selected as ambassadors in their respective communities. Young people were trained through the workshop, and it was made sure that they can contribute to monitoring these violence processes happening within their local communities. Plus, they also use particular barometer to monitor and evaluate the effectiveness of independent commission. And various stakeholders were also participating in that. But that was coming together from the government and from the young people themselves. But coming back into more practicalities, and that was, I promise, that was the longest, I was talking about the theory and boring stuff. I'll go a little bit more into the practice. Going back into the practice, what we believe in the peace building field, you can only understand the people if you feel them in yourself. So we can only understand the suffering that people are going through if you try to understand what they feel, if you try to understand what goes through their emotions, through their feelings, what is their needs. And quite often what we use is the iceberg model of human complexity. So what we see above the waterline is only 10-15%, but that's our behavior, that's our emotions, that's our reactions. But below the waterline is actually something that drives us all. That can be our family situation, that can be our history, our background, but all of this combined really influences the way how we engage, but also how we communicate with the other people. And it really influences the way how we solve the conflicts, whether during the active stage of the war in Ukraine or after the active stage of the war. Because at some point, we will need to have a space for dialogue, either dialogue within our local communities, happening with IDPs, soldiers who are coming back from the battle, or dialogue in a broader sense, happening with the country who is an aggressor. And the time will come, maybe not now, maybe in 10 years, in 20 years, when we'll have to sit and we'll have to talk. So trying to understand this human complexity is the first step in creating the foundations for the peace building. What we usually do, and some of the students of Ukrainian Leadership Academy who have been at my workshop, I think remember this. What happens when we enter the conflict or when we enter a situation that really triggers us? Usually our brain is like this. So we are functioning, we are thinking, we are trying to rationalize, to understand what is happening around us. But when something flips, when there is a situation that triggers us, situation which is critical, which is very aggressive towards us, our brain goes like this, so the lid goes out, and we stop thinking clearly. We go into this fight, flight, or freeze response, which really prevents us from proper communication, of proper resolving the conflict. And really trying to understand what drives our behavior, what need do we have behind all of it, is a first step towards aiming the foundation of the peace. But what I wanted to share with you today, and this is something that has to be rethinking and also had to be done in the future as a future assessment, is adverse childhood experiences and the impact of the brain. So what happens when the child is being impacted to triggering situations, to conflict, to the war? This really influences the way how the brain develops, but also how we behave when we are older, when we are in our middle age, when we are in our 20s or 30s. And it really impacts the way how we solve our conflicts. So right now, thinking about this case study, that was the largest case study ever done. It was performed by the Kaiser Permanent Institute and the Center for Disease Control, where they interviewed 17,000 people in California, trying to find a connection, why people who are grown up, who are adults, had problems with alcohol, with drugs, had been in the prison, had problems with their marriage. And the problem was that there was a direct connection with the experiences that young kids go through and their adult life. So whatever happens when we are 2, 3, 5, 6, 7, 10 years old really influences the way how we behave as adults. But now looking into all of it, try to understand what impact the war has right now on the kids and on the young people, on the people who are just like you joining our webinar today. So it's a lot of emotions and feelings which are boiling underneath the surface, which really prevent us from thinking clearly and trying to understand how we can create this sustainable peace in our country. And the ACEs, adverse childhood experiences in the usual life, they refer to physical, emotional, sexual abuse that can be mental illness of one of the parents, which results in behaviors, lack of physical ability, smoking, alcoholism, drug abuse, and missed work. Now, if we try to expand it a little bit bigger, in the bigger perspective and looking into the war, the impact will be much, much worse. Because those young kids, those young people, people like you, people like us, we witness the deaths and war and destructions, missile attack. And it really have impacts on our mental health, but also on our physical health in the future. But is there a way? Is there a way in how to create conditions for sustainable peace, but also work with all this impact that we feel on our skins every single day? And the way is to build up resilience and to work with trauma. Resilience is the capacity to recover quickly from the difficulties, to bounce back. Imagine a palm tree, which is bending, but is not breaking. So this is how resilience looks like. We can bend, but we're not gonna break. And there are different paths to work for resilience. There is social ecological framework, which is based on societal, community relationship and individual connections. So basically, we're trying to understand how we work within all the vertical and horizontal lines together with the society on every single level. And Ukraine has a great case study of that, because Ukrainians have been demonstrating a high level of solidarity and joint work together. So this is something where we come together. We already have the foundations to create this framework for resilience. But it also has to come from every single individual, from each one of you, just trying to understand where is my place here on the social model and how I can contribute to creating an equal and social justice society. And there are 6 domains of individual resilience that we usually work with. One of the most important, in my opinion, is social and emotional learning and also mindfulness. So we are trying to understand that there is a lot of things going on around us, but we can create support systems, and we can work with positive values, and we can work with educations and friendship, and we can find the people who will support us on that way. So this is where the mindfulness fits, and this is how it actually fits within the whole global model of the peace building, bringing this together on the levels where we connect to the society, but also we connect to each other. And equity and social justice actually refers to ability to meet the needs that are not being met, affected by the factors at every level of the social ecological model. So currently, right now, if you think about the needs, single one of us is impacted. Single one of us doesn't know how to talk about the war experience. How do we talk about trauma? How do we talk about the people that we have lost within the war? And this is where we can create a space for the dialogues, but also space for talking about our experiences and sharing. And this is the first step in creating conditions for the peace. I really like this picture. I always show it. It always says, what is that? Or it's just my mind. This is really something that can be applied to any single one of us. We never know what is behind the person's mind, what troubles, worries, issues the person has right now, but really trying to take a step back and try to understand that we are all humans and we are all on the same level together is a first step. Societal resilience factors, if you talk about them, and I'll be trying to wrap up my presentation. I know I want to give Kai also an opportunity to share from his experience, but 3 pillars that societal resilience programs should focus on is peace building education programs, resources and effective plans in place, but also restorative justice programs. And restorative justice programs, it's actually where we allow the people to heal, where we offer victims a safe process, because as I said, everyone is impacted within communities, but we also support offenders to take responsibility for the harm. In my opinion, restorative justice programs will be the pillar of peace building programs and recovery programs in Ukraine after the war, but foundation for those programs should be laid right now, and we shouldn't be waiting for too long for that. And the last that I wanted to share with you before I finish up, it's a quote from Rumi. It says, wounded healer from surviving to striving, and it refers to the psychological capacity to be at home in the darkness of suffering, but also to find there the spark of light in recovery. So even though every single one of us is being wounded right now, we all are impacted by the war, the wound is the place where the light enters you. Ukrainians have showed great solidarity right now. Ukrainians have showed great support to each other. And this is our strength. This is where our resilience comes from. And I really encourage all of you to support each other and to share what you feel and how you feel. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Maria. I won't add absolutely anything to what was said. And passing the floor to Kybran Jacobson.
Thank you, Laura. I want to start with saying thank you to everyone who is joining us today. And thank you especially to everyone who's joining us from inside Ukraine, Dyakuyu, as well as Ukrainians all around the world. And I also want to express my deepest admiration and respect for you and for joining and making the decision to take part in this event today, because it is incredibly important. I have worked, as Laura mentioned, I've been working in countries affected by war since I was 17 years old. And so I have had deep experience with war in many countries for more years than many joining today have been alive. And that's why I'm aware of how incredibly important it is to have this conversation about what is it you want for the future of your country beyond the war as well. And it may, as Maria said, seem absurd or strange, or how can we talk about building Ukraine beyond the war when right now, in this very moment, there are people on the front lines and so many in Ukraine are fighting for the country to survive. But it is important in this moment to reflect and to understand, as Maria shared, about what is the impact the war is having on each person as individuals and on the country as a whole, and what do you want after the war. And it is very important to realize that there is not one war that is happening now. There isn't one experience of this war. There are millions of experiences, and people are living it and experiencing it in many different ways. I want to share with you a bit of a presentation, as Maria did as well. And Laura, is it coming through? Can it be seen? Okay. And the first thing I actually wanted to do is to ask all of us to take a moment and to think of those who are no longer with us due to the war. Because for over a year now, we have been constantly living in this extreme of the moment and trying to survive, trying to see how to reach safety, how to help each other, people involved in seeing how to fight and to protect the country. And yet, hundreds of thousands of people altogether have also been being killed. And it is important that even now in the midst of the war, we take the space to hold and to recognize that and to be able to grieve. And to recognize, as Maria said as well, the incredible response that has happened across Ukraine. And I could show you literally tens of thousands of pictures now of people of all ages and all backgrounds all across the country, inside Ukraine and outside, and many of you as well, who have been involved in working to respond to the war and to help. And as some of you have heard me say in the past, while I have spent 25 years working in context of war, I have never in my life seen anything like the response in Ukraine and what people have done across the country to help at every single level. But the importance of this event tonight and the discussion that we hope it will begin is because the challenges of building peace and of rebuilding and reconstruction after war, individually and personally, in families, in society, physical reconstruction, in every possible way you can imagine, the challenges are immense. And when we're in the midst of a war, we're often focusing on fighting the war and having the war end. But if we do not understand and prepare for the scale of the challenges that come after, and also for what we can do now, then the legacy and the impact of the war can be much, much more devastating on the entire country and on everyone involved. This is a map which might be hard to see depending upon how you're joining us, whether by phone or on computer. And it's based upon reviewing experiences in working to recover after war in one of the largest studies ever done from countries all over the world. And it looks through in-depth case studies at countries in Europe, in the Americas, across the Middle East, across Asia, across Africa that have been in war, at those who've handled it well and those who haven't, and where their challenges have been. And it looks at the need to address issues, many of which Maria mentioned. But for example, how do you address physical security and people's sense of security after a war, including, perhaps some of you are with us from the Ukrainian Leadership Academy in Lviv, who we met with when we were in Ukraine in March. And at that time, some of the youth who were with us were mentioning that it seemed weird to them if they weren't hearing sirens and if they weren't hearing missiles, because they had become so used to it. So it's not only the reality of security, it's also people's sense of security, including for people who've been displaced, people who have had families separated, people who have lived through daily bombardment in the worst affected areas. There's the need to address how do we acknowledge and address the underlying drivers of conflict. It is very easy to look at this war as only happening because Russia invaded Ukraine. And that is a massive and overwhelming component of it. But everyone in Ukraine also knows that there are issues and challenges in the country. There were deep issues and conflicts and divides within Ukraine, including, especially at the political level, issues of corruption amongst the political elite, issues of suppression of media in different areas. There were challenges and underlying issues inside the country that for yourself, regardless of anything from Russia, one should want to see how do you want to address actual underlying issues at a regional level, but also within the country. And what's the vision you have for the future of your country when it comes to healing and addressing those? Ukraine has faced for decades the challenges of handling political power and arrangements amongst different political factions. How will that be addressed? What about the relationship between the state and society and different sectors of society, and issues of economic fairness and opportunity and social cohesion? Now, these are not just titles or labels. These are massive areas of deep issues and challenges that are affecting the country that were not solved overnight before the war began, and they won't be solved overnight after the war. And the difference now is that you're also dealing with the entire visible and invisible impacts and effects of the war on the society. This shows some of the different countries around the world, and we won't go into it now, but we can share these studies with you to look at what has worked, what hasn't worked in different areas, and even more to help support the space for you as youth and citizens of Ukraine to be discussing what do you want in your country. But the point is that the field of working to deal with physical reconstruction, with psychological healing, with improving relations in society is as vast as the fields of medicine or engineering or anything else. But there are very few countries where people study and are trained in how to do this. So one of the really critical needs to reflect on now in Ukraine is also how to build up the knowledge and understanding and capabilities for how to work on these issues within the country. Because, for example, dealing with the area of trauma, as Maria mentioned, while there are some people, such as the Crisis Psychologist Response Network in Ukraine who have been working with this, the scale of the need is far larger than the capacity that is there today. Now, what's important to recall, as Maria also highlighted, is that in the majority of cases, even after war has stopped, it breaks out again. So within 15 years, only about half of what are called peace spells, periods of peace, survive. As you know from your own experience, from 2014, and then continual micro-scale fighting until a later larger war. And there's the very real possibility when a country has been through war that if we don't establish effective security and peace after, then the violence now could just be one phase in a cycle that could continue also after. Looking at a global study, it was seen that in about 50% of cases where the UN had intervened to build peace, it had to return to make peace again within 10 years because war had broken out again. So why is this happening? Why is it so difficult? One of the reasons that people often speak about is the complexity and the difficulty of the issue and the context or the issues involved. Another is the agendas and the interests of different actors, countries, institutions. But there's also a third reality, how badly stabilization, recovery, and peace is done after war, and how badly it is usually done is one of the reasons that war continually breaks out after. Some of the negative or bad factors that we see constantly around the world. Right now, Ukraine is getting more international aid than almost any other country that has gone through war. Just as one example, you've had more weapons sent to Ukraine in the last 12 months than were sent into Iraq and Afghanistan combined over 20 years put together. And it hasn't only been the military assistance. There's been massive humanitarian aid to Ukraine as well, and to Ukrainians abroad. But what you have seen is nothing compared to what happens after the war ends. After a war ends, international NGOs flood into a country. Sometimes they have no background in the area. They may not know your country. Most won't speak the language. Often they'll have very high salaries, and they can raise also the price of rent in apartments and costs of living. And the challenge is that as much as there are donor meetings and coordination calls happening, there is very little meaningful joint up planning and joint coordination. You have major conferences are held and promises are made, and often with little or no consultation or inclusion of those from the country. You may have the government involved. You may have some major agencies or think tanks, but many sectors of the population are left out and their voices are not heard. There's a multitude of agencies, donors, organizations who come each with their piece of the pie and their idea of what they think is important. The needs are huge, but the scale of the resources to meet them is not. And the continuing impact of the war on many levels remains unaddressed. Also, massive flows of money and projects create context for corruption. We've even seen this now during the war, and we saw it before the war. So you'll have cases where hundreds of millions or large amounts of money can simply go where it should not, instead of going where it's needed. Also, projects are very often short-term, with a lot of duplication and a lot of gaps where important issues aren't being met. Why am I sharing this? And I could go on more. There's far, far more than just this in terms of the problems of how post-war recovery is handled. And why I'm sharing it is because agency and power should be held by those whose country it is, by those who have lived through the war and experienced it, and for whom it is the future of your country. Ukrainians have engaged extraordinarily in this moment of the war, in leading at every level what is needed for your country. But there's the danger that afterwards, because aid is fractured, because different donors support different NGOs, it fuels divisions. And what often happens is people become dependent. They ask the donor to support our project, and everyone wants their project supported. And what often doesn't happen is the people of a country or a society to come together and to say yourselves, what is important? What are your priorities? What do you want? And to communicate those to foreign countries, to your own government, and to the donors. I just want to share from a review of international engagement in wars, and this was focusing on mediators, but this was focusing on some of the what are called 7 deadly sins when foreigners engage in a situation. And this was put together by Lakhdar Brahimi, one of the most famous UN mediators in the world. And some of the things we'll often see is ignorance. So people will come in and really not know the situation in your country. I have a dear and beloved friend and colleague who, when leaving an embassy of a major international actor in Ukraine, felt like crying because of how profoundly ignorant they were about the country. And that was now during the war. Arrogance. People think they know what's best for your country and that they can solve it and come in and feel that they're experts on different issues. Partiality. People will be biased and prejudiced to one group or one issue or one agency or friend they want to support. Impotence. They often don't have the power to really affect meaningful change. Haste. Sometimes there's a agenda and a timeline that's imposed upon local and national organizations because of the haste of foreign donors wanting to show results. Inflexibility. We saw this massively during the war, where thousands upon thousands of Ukrainians responded with humanitarian assistance and helping, and then foreign donors came and had 80 or 90-page application forms that had to be completed, and many small-scale volunteer initiatives just could not address that, and the donor response was not meeting the local needs. Also, false promises. For example, when there are donor conferences and they pledge money to rebuild the country, they almost never deliver on what they have promised. It will be much, much less. Ukraine today, you know your country much better than I do. But I would like to share some of what we've seen inside Ukraine and with allies over the last 12 months. There are different Ukraines. There are some areas like Kyiv, Lviv, Chernivtsi, and others that have been fortunate to be somewhat further from the war, or may have experienced it heavily in earlier periods, but are not experiencing it as intensely now, although we have seen since the autumn the intentional increase by Russian forces on striking civilian infrastructure. There are those areas currently under occupation. And to imagine and understand what people in those areas are living through. And many of you may have family and others in those areas. There are newly liberated or deoccupied territories, which may have heavy destruction, which may have experienced brutality on a massive scale from occupation forces, from the invading forces, and which are having to deal with recovery, with trying to rebuild homes, trying to get systems functioning again. There's the areas that are being directly fought over and contested, where there are still civilians in many of them. There are the huge numbers of millions of Ukrainians displaced inside Ukraine, and the millions of Ukrainian refugees displaced outside the country. And also children and youth as a particular category who are being affected in so many different ways. And highly vulnerable and at-risk groups. These can be people who have medical needs, emotional needs, elderly, and others who are being impacted and who are at risk. And soldiers and medical workers and others who are directly on the front lines in what they're experiencing. You have trauma impacted on a massive scale. Combatants, many of whom are also experiencing daily intense combat experience protracted over months. and then the broader range of frontline workers, humanitarian, refugee workers, and others. So just to show, I'm sorry, I've spoken too much already, and I just want to show some of the areas that have to be addressed in post-war recovery. One is dealing with physical destruction and damage. And destruction in Ukraine is massive and substantial, but heaviest in the most affected areas. It's not evenly spread across the country. It includes destruction of buildings, homes, schools and hospitals, roads and infrastructure, factories, which were specifically targeted, power plants, electric grids, water mains, critical civilian infrastructure, but also the intentional attacks on cultural centers, historical monuments, faith sites, and others. And as we've seen, there are huge ranges in the costing of what it will take to rebuild, but between 358 to 70 billion euros. But what's important is to realize that the cost of recovery is more than just financial. The human impact of the war that Maria spoke to a bit, and the impact on so many levels. And this is not only about what's often called post-traumatic stress disorder. It's about much more. The daily experience of anxiety, stress, uncertainty, fear, depression, self-blame, loneliness, emotional exhaustion, and trauma. We have had Ukrainian refugees abroad who have also committed suicide because of what they felt about having left the country and with their loved ones still in the country, or when they found out what happened to loved ones. The human and emotional impact of the war is much more than just trauma. There's a breadth and a range of emotions and both intense and protracted life experiences, which have immediate and long-term impact on people and society as a whole. What's very important that we would encourage is never to use the term post-traumatic stress disorder. Because when you do it, you can be calling, you can be saying that someone has a disorder. So how many people in the military or how many people are going to get help if you say what they have is a disorder? It's also often not about post-traumatic because the trauma is continuing and they're continuing to experience and to live with it. And Maria already mentioned some of the issues that it can lead to, including inability to manage emotions, negative thoughts and feelings, including to the point of suicide. In some countries, the number of people who have died in the 10 years after the war from suicide has been higher than the numbers of people that died from the war itself. It can affect people's ability to perform in relations, work, and daily functions. It has a dramatic impact on reduced school performance and learning for many. And there can be transgenerational trauma as it is handed on not only to those who lived through the war, but transmitted through shared collective experience, storytelling, and impact on families. We have also seen it leads to a dramatic increase in domestic and family abuse and sexual violence during and after the war. Some of the program areas that we are encouraging that need to be addressed is to support and train Ukrainian trauma care, emergency psychological care, and long-term trauma and recovery care. Also, awareness raising with governments, policymakers, donors, local government authorities, teachers, media, and wider society. To support immediate programs that are addressing those most at need, but also a broad spectrum approach. And we can share more about that in future work. And the need for trauma first aid on a massive scale with youth, medical workers, combatants, and those most affected. But also to bring trauma-informed education and resilience and well-being education into schools at every level, and to integrate it into humanitarian and recovery programming. There's more we could cover, but just to look at some other aspects. The dimension of engaging with internally displaced peoples. Millions of people are displaced inside Ukraine. Families are separated, often their homes are destroyed, and they may not be able to go back to areas even if the fighting were to stop today. So this is from December. It was the newest figures I could find and confirm. At that point, 680,000 people had been newly displaced within the last 30 days. Over 5.9 million were displaced across the country. 7% were considering leaving their area, but 2/3 of IDPs across the country anticipate that they will need to stay in their current locations for at least 6 months or more. Now, one challenge we're facing abroad for refugees abroad is that 90% of the aid in some countries outside is being cut, and many foreign agencies are cutting. Some of the aid inside Ukraine may go down as well. So there really is a need to look at how to both strengthen and continue international support, but also how to build the national resilience and response from the government when, for example, there have also been cuts. Other critical areas. Soldiers and health workers now are experiencing protracted trauma. At the end of the war, and even now, you may have to look at how to help reintegrating combatants into families. And these are boyfriends, girlfriends, mothers, fathers, children, people of all backgrounds. And it may seem like this is our family, these are our loved ones, they are our heroes, we can bring them back in. But there's a lot more that's involved. People have lived through very difficult experiences, and understanding that at individual levels, relationship levels, family levels, and supporting them will be a task that very, very few truly grasp how huge it is. It is something that you do not need to wait till the end of the war for. There are great organizations in Ukraine like Peace Engineers, which are trying to provide psychological support to combatants now to help them for recovery after. And it's important to realize that so much of what can be done to help recovery after can also begin now. Weapons. This is going to be a massive issue. Already we're seeing that between 2 to 4% of weapons that go to Ukraine are not accounted for in addition to battlefield losses. So this is an area where more weapons have been sent to Ukraine than any war zone in the world in the last 20 years. And the issue of what happens after to these weapons can be very important for both local, national, regional, and international security. The impact of the war on children and youth, as has already been discussed, who are experiencing it in so many different ways, but also to mention that a lot of young Ukrainians today are being educated and trained with the reality of people living through war, including the idea of we must fight the enemy, we must destroy them, they're to blame for killing us, and a lot of war experience, which can have deep impacts on the future society. And the last thing I want to share, I have much, much more, but I'm going to stop talking, and my experience, my apologies for speaking so much, but I want to emphasize the incredible importance of you as youth and the potential you have today. This is a picture of something else. This is a picture that shows that 74% of those killed in war are young men between the ages of 15 to 29. Youth around the world live with the failure of older generations, live with the failure of men, overwhelmingly men, old, ridiculous, pathetic, incompetent men like Putin and others, who take the decision to go to war and affect the lives of millions. These were 4 youth who were sent by over 20,000 in 2008 to New York to tell the United Nations that the voice of youth needs to be heard in peace building, in security, in recovery and reconstruction. And the young woman that you see, Abhilasa from Nepal, stood up and said, if we are old enough to be told to fight, if we're old enough to be killed, if we're old enough to be raped, you have to accept that we are old enough to work for our countries and to work for peace building and to raise our voices for what we want for the future of our countries. This is a picture of youth who were displaced by war and affected by war in their country in Iraq, who are working on trauma recovery programs. Every single person here is a youth who was forced out of their home by the war. These are women who were all survivors of rape in their country, who came together to create their own organization to look at how to support healing and recovery and to make sure that their voice was heard. These are former combatants, all of them youth, as younger than many joining today. But they created an association after the war because they felt that many of the critical issues and problems facing the country remained. I have already said a few times that I have spoken too much, and I apologize for that. I don't know if the presentation has stopped. I'm trying to tell it to. So hopefully there it has. And even though I've spoken a lot, I've hardly even begun to cover the scale of what's involved in post-war recovery. Now you have an amazing strength. You have a strength of a people of incredible solidarity, incredible resilience and capacity, and with much of the world responding and supporting. The challenges will be significant, and the time to engage to address them isn't only when the fighting stops, but right now. Дякую.
Thank you very much, Kai. Now we pass through the period of Q&A and interaction with the participants. And we have already a hand up. I'll be monitoring the chat as well. So please, Vadim, you can unmute yourself and make your intervention.
Hello, my name is Olha, and I have a question. So you've been spoken about our needs and our resources, that this will be hard to those two like ends meet. So my question is, how can we actually as youth help to meet our needs of our country and resources that can give us other countries and that our country actually has? Thank you.
Thank you so much as well. Maria, do you want to take a go at that first?
I think that one was for you, Kai.
So I would give a few answers. One is to first, to start by really listening and looking and seeing. Look within yourselves, within your community, within your country at what the needs are. Just like when doctors work in medicine, the first thing they do is diagnostics. You have to understand the problems. It's really important to map out what is it that needs to be addressed, the scale of the need, but also to look and understand and see your strengths, your power, your resources. There is a mistake that is often made when we're dealing with recovery during and after war, where people all think, I need to get funding, I need to get a donor project. But as you know, and as the people of Ukraine know, it's not just about money that comes from outside or from donors. There's a wealth of resources and there's a lot that you can do inside the country. So today, the number of people that are trained in trauma first aid is small, but in the spirit in Ukraine, you can train each other and get more people to train and support to build up a national program. You can collaborate, build organizations and spaces where you come together. For example, very often in many countries, NGOs compete with each other, as I mentioned, each separately trying to get funds. Another approach that we've seen in other countries is they create local platforms and national platforms where the different organizations come together and they jointly identify what are the needs, and then they say to the government and say to the donors, this is what you need to support. Also, to look at how to do recovery where it's not just based upon donor funds, but to think smartly at how you can generate economic activity that helps to create employment, helps to create basically investment that fuels reconstruction and recovery. That's a very important approach to take. So there are resources, and again, it is about more than money. It's about resilience and will. It's about culture. It's about solidarity. It's about so many resources within your people and your community that you can draw upon. The last thing I want to say, you'll have noticed I talk too much. I'm sorry for that. But another critical element in harvesting resources is vision. So I've been asked by many governments around the world to advise them on post-war recovery. And what I see almost always is a total absence of vision. In one country, it has a very brutal regime, very authoritarian in many ways, but it is one of the most successful models in post-war recovery, Rwanda. And there are many negative aspects about what has happened in Rwanda. But where Rwanda was brilliant was it created a vision and an idea of its future and of achieving it, which convinced many internationally to invest. Now, you in Ukraine are very lucky in one respect. I apologize for using that term in the context of such a horrible, horrible war. But you're lucky in that no one in history almost has had the level of attention you do. But I would encourage you to be smart in how you engage with that. If you let foreign NGOs and donors dictate the agenda and come in with what they want to do, then you'll become dependent and ask them. Instead, inspire the world like you have already for so much, and have your vision so that you bring people in as allies to support you.
Thank you, Kai. I'm monitoring the chat and we have expressions of solidarity and also questions. I am going to read the two questions that Nicole put in the chat. The first one is, we know that when it comes to peace building, women are often underrepresented. How can we ensure that women are at the negotiation table and their needs are accounted for? This is the first question. The second question is, there is research that shows negative effect, for example, Haiti, of long-term aid that creates dependency and hurts the economy. What foreign contribution do you think are most valuable, and how do we prevent paternalistic interference? Two amazing questions. Maria, would you like to take a lead on those first?
Yeah, I can go on the first one, I think. Usually, always women are engaged in the topics of gender equality in high-level negotiations. I'm just going to tell you a small example from my practice. I was facilitating a dialogues in the MENA region with high-level officials. And one of the questions was actually, how do we involve women in negotiation process and peace building? And one of the men answered, they should not be allowed because this is about decision making and women cannot make proper decisions. And that was a moment which really struck me and made my blood go cold, because I was thinking, okay, in 21st century, women cannot make decisions. I think the most important answer to all of this is empower the women. Explain the women that they have the rights and they have opportunities, and also that there is a difference between representation and participation. So if you're going to be going under the numbers, oh, let's have 50% of women, 50% of men, that's not going to make a difference. But if you're going to go after active participation of women, after women who know what they're doing there, after women who are very sure about themselves, who are able to voice out the needs and challenges, then you'll have an impact. And that can be achieved only by training, by supporting the women on the ground, but also by empowering them. Because very often women are scared to participate, and especially if you're a young woman, if you come from a rural community, if you didn't have an opportunity, sometimes you feel like your voice doesn't matter. But all the voices matter. So question here is, how do we create opportunities for women to show their voices? So that's in short about the first question. I think Kai will take the second one.
If it would be okay, I'd like to speak to the first one as well, because women's participation in peace processes and in every level of politics, governance, and rebuilding your country is not a women's issue. It's an issue for every single citizen. And it's a responsibility of every citizen, women and men, to stand up and to demand women's participation and inclusion and authentic engagement at every single level. I say this because quite often we have the idea that women's participation is a women's issue and that only women should speak up and be engaged with it, and it is not. Every man of every age has the duty and responsibility. The vast and overwhelming violence against women is done by men. The most dangerous animal in the world for a woman is a man. And the most overwhelming violence done against men is done by men as well. I've been in 12 high-level peace talks and peace processes. Women were not present in any of them except one, at any significant level. In the others, they were photographers or they brought coffee. And yet you are at least half or more than half of the population. We know as fact that governments in which women make up above a certain percentage of decision makers in parliament and others actually have less chance of going to war, have better economic equality and better development. We know that when you have above a certain percentage of women in governance and parliaments, you have a reduced likelihood of getting into war in the first place. This is not just because of women, it's because of many factors, but it is vital. Now, if you want to ask how to address it, there's some critical things that need to be done. So how can you ensure? Organize. Organize as organizations dedicated to the issue, but also organize and encourage every organization in Ukraine to make a commitment to gender inclusion and equality. Not just women's organizations, but organizations like ULA, Ukrainian Leadership Academy, which plays such a powerful role and has such an incredible vision for leadership roles and skills and how to support people, could embrace and may already, but this commitment to ensuring inclusion at every single level. You as youth do not have to wait for the European Commission, the United Nations, or the Ukrainian government to come with their plan for recovery or for peace talks. You should organize and create your vision for what you want, and then bring that forward and ensure inclusion, gender, age, but also make sure people from different parts of the countries, from different communities are all included. Organize, train and build capacity, support each other, including through difficult moments, and dare. Do not wait for someone to give you permission. Do not wait for someone to tell you, okay, now you can come and sit with us. It's your country, your right. And apologies for the question on external involvement. That's where this dimension of building up your national capacity, strengthening organizations at local and national levels, creating national platforms and conferences where you come together and decide and discuss what you want, bringing forward your agenda to international agencies, and even doing things like creating a code of conduct for foreign organizations. Did you know that 95% of all funding for recovery and for peace building goes to foreign agencies? This is global. Only 5% goes to local and national. You should be very clear in communicating and demanding to donors and the European Commission to channel funds to support and build up capacity nationally. Also, make sure you put in place mechanisms for monitoring, evaluation, and learning from what's working and what isn't working to improve it, because there will be a lot of mistakes and you need to ensure accountability. Now, behind everything I'm saying, every proposal, every idea, there are really a lot that can be done practically to learn how to do it. And as an organization, we'll do everything we can to support for those who want to go further into that.
Thank you, Kai. Still connected to aid, we have a question from Igor Veloso, basically asking if there is a need to attract a foreign legion of builders and logistics into Ukraine, or if the internal necessities will be filled in within the country.
I think it's a little bit early to talk about rebuilding, even though we have been discussing that it should start right now and we should lay foundation for peace. But for now, it's hard to predict because every day the missiles are being fired in Ukraine. Even this night, we had 3 hits in Khmelnytsky, where the buildings have been destroyed. So for now, our focus is creating capacities for Ukraine to win the war, creating capacities to stop the violence, to stop fighting, to stop killing of the people, and then we'll talk about rebuilding. I think Ukraine will appreciate any help that we can get. Ukrainians will be grateful for the Foreign Legion coming to rebuild Ukraine, for people sending donations, for people just coming to support and listening in. For now, what is the most important, that the people don't forget that Ukraine exists and we have suffering going on every day.
Only Ukrainians have the right to answer this question. So I won't answer, but I'll share a perspective. There is a need for reconstruction support right now and recovery support right now. So yes, Maria spoke in terms of the focus on the war, but the reality is Ukraine is experiencing massive destruction, significant destruction daily, to electricity infrastructure, to water infrastructure, to buildings and schools. There is a need for reconstruction that is happening right now. And it's very important that that be supported. However, I would suggest that the greatest role we can play from outside Ukraine is as honest and authentic allies. We should be working to get resources to the people of Ukraine to rebuild themselves, also because it generates jobs and livelihoods and power and ownership. And I would say we need to be very careful about war, recovery, conflict, tourism, where well-meaning people from abroad come to help. Now, if in Ukraine, they set up a national program for recovery where people can contribute and foreigners can come be part of that, and it's well managed, well designed, and you're given lessons in Ukrainian, you're given roles you can do that can help, then it could also be great to show solidarity and show people you care and be present with them. But one of the huge challenges of programs where people volunteer, come from abroad, is you're often more of a burden on the host organization than a help. And it's well-meaning, but it's often hard for them to handle. So it's important that these things be done properly. If it's being done from within Europe, the European Commission should create a special component of the European Solidarity Corps program for supporting recovery in Ukraine. And if it's being done internationally, it would be great if UN Volunteers has a large-scale program to assist it, so it's done well. But I would really encourage the first and foremost should be the support to the people of Ukraine in their recovery rather than coming to do it directly.
Thank you very much for both perspectives that were shown. We have another speaker with their hands up, Ukrainian Leadership Academy.
Hello, my name is Maxim, and I have one question. Can you say us more about the interest of foreign agencies or maybe companies keep working in Ukraine, and how can we make them stay in Ukraine now? Thank you.
Maria, do you want to go first? Or?
Go ahead, Kai.
All right. So there's a range of interests. And I think on the one hand, we just have to also be realistic and smart. Like I was speaking, a group of us from our team were speaking with one foreign embassy where the person really knew a lot. They had deep understanding, and I would say deep and authentic solidarity with Ukraine. However, it was very clear the undercurrents from what they were talking about, that they also see this as a huge financial opportunity for their companies, their country's companies. I don't think they were even self-aware of it, but there was a massive level of selfishness and greed that was just dripping off of it and was very clear. And the reality is that actually can help you if they see an opportunity. What you don't want is what you could call the Lebanon model, or what we've seen in other countries. So in Lebanon, reconstruction was taken over by basically a few rich companies that controlled overwhelmingly and got very rich out of it. And the majority of the population did not benefit. And that can be a local, national, corrupt capture of the recovery, and it can also be with foreign agencies coming in. I think really looking at partnership-based models. For example, Ukraine, has brilliant IT. You've had a lot of IT people abroad. pitch and market this vision of Ukraine in IT and connecting people's investment. Help people to feel a societal and cultural association and connection to Ukraine, also after the war. As Maria said before, you need to keep people's interest in it. And Ukraine has been brilliant in that during the war in many ways. Your citizens, your people at every level, the government also. So it's about trying to think through how can you build healthy partnerships, make sure that your needs and your dignity are respected. Look at the laws, okay? Because outside countries will play a role in trying to rewrite your laws. The United States tried to do this in Iraq, where they tried to get the parliament to change its laws so US companies could take over the local oil. These things matter. So much of what happens that affects the future of your country happens in the dark. It happens in negotiations or private deals, as the last 30 years amongst oligarchs and wealthy in Ukraine, or it happens in conferences where the voices of people and people themselves are not there. So how to keep them involved, make sure you do everything you can to reduce corruption, put in place mechanisms for transparency. So for example, require that contracts for rebuilding be made public. And all these programs, there are brilliant IT programs that have already been created to look at transparency and bidding and make sure these things are done in the open light. And if you can become a good practice model for this, then you'll be championed and you'll attract more investment as well. So people often think when we're recovering from war that you're in a deficit. You're not. You are on many levels from destruction, but you can think in terms of what type of society you want and what you want in the future and put it into practice now. Another thing I would encourage is to promote participatory budgeting at local levels. This has been an incredibly effective initiative to ensure that the resources of local governments are effectively used to address needs identified by the population. So it's not only about the foreign investment, but also your popular democratic control over your local and national investment as well.
If you would like to add anything.
Also, sometimes it's important to understand that quite often people who are coming from abroad to Ukraine, as Kai was mentioning, they have their own interests. That's normal that we have seen in all the countries across Africa where people come just because it boosts their career. It's good for them to work in the UN or any other international NGOs. At the same time, there are people who are very passionate. There are organizations who really get it, who really understand what is happening on the ground. And those organizations are making the change. That really is possible. And I know because I have been working with Patria and I have seen the impact and effect, and maybe I'm bragging a little bit right now, but I really have seen the effect on the ground, effect that we have been doing. So the question here is, of course, trying to understand the reason, the motivation of the organizations who are coming into the country, who are coming to work on the field, but also what opportunities they provide to the people, what opportunities they give to the people. Are they giving trainings? Are they offering workshops? Are they focused solely on just giving the grant, get some revenue back and just be out? So again, the question is, it's very different on different levels and important to take into consideration in the peace building field.
Can I ask a significant message of what we've been saying is essentially that your voices matter and your vision matters. But we've been doing that by sharing our voices. And I wonder if we might sort of change that for a moment and not ask you to tell us your questions or to give us questions. Please, you're welcome to. And if you have more, we want to do everything we can to support. But instead of questions, maybe we can open the microphone to you for whoever would like to share what you feel is important in thinking about building the future of Ukraine. And especially in terms of the role of you and the role of youth. I know many with us today are youth. I also see some names of some of the most beautiful and amazing people I've gotten to know over the past year who are Ukrainians, either in Ukraine or Ukrainians abroad, who've been doing so much for their people. And maybe we can just, or at least me, the foreigner, turn over the microphone to you, or if people want to write in the chat or to say, what are your thoughts about everything we've been discussing? What has been most important or powerful for you? And perhaps most importantly of all, what do you want for the future of your country? And please speak in Ukrainian, Russian, English, Norwegian, Romanian, or any language you feel comfortable with. One of the things I love in Ukraine is how beautifully inclusive and diverse and wonderful it is.
As the facilitator, I fully endorse this shift. So whenever you feel ready. Please.
Hi, can I share my opinion right now? Okay, so the problem I see in Ukraine that like, it is that our nation only unites when we have the enemy, but we don't unite if we don't have it. So my point is that we need to be more like try to connect more with each other and just try to be to share the culture of humanity in our country more, as there's like certainly a problem of our communication between in different regions. So I think the really great part of our peacebuilding will also be connecting with each others, so we can learn about each other. And I think when we will know like our nation from different angles, if we can say so, we will be more like. Is something wrong? I'm sorry.
No, all is good. Please proceed.
Oh, okay, okay. So my point is that we need to be like kind of a crew, not just a group of friends and people, so we can make like our goal more achievable if we work on it together. So that's it. Thanks.
Дякую.
Thank you. Would any of the speakers would like to give a replica to that?
No, the idea is no speakers, just listen to everyone else.
Okay. Would any of the participants? Yes, please.
Yeah, so let me share my thoughts. I think first of all, I'm Clifford, I'm from Kenya, and I've been following the development from Ukraine for the past 1 year. And just the personal interest that I have, like where would envision Ukraine to be at. The speaker has been very candid on how they support that the participatory approaches that he tries to mention. The active age of Ukrainians are currently out of the country, or they are actively involved in the war. Now, when you reach at the phase of rebuilding, do you think there'll be that right mental state or that right productivity state to be involved in the rebuilding of Ukraine? And then there was also what he mentioned on how this can be marshaled. I believe if you get volunteers from any part of Africa, from Europe, people can just offer their time to get involved in Ukraine. I think this is something that it's also an approach that can be really looked into, because I believe that once the war is over and rebuilding needs to continue immediately, Ukrainians will need some rest, recover. So that is my only thoughts and worries on the participatory approaches we talk about. They'll need external support for their own benefit. That's my thought. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Please, Ukrainian Leadership Academy, with their hands up.
Hi, my name is Marichka. Okay, hi, and for me personally, it is important that Ukraine becomes more inclusive in the future. because I think the more inclusive we make Ukraine, the more opportunities everyone has to realize their talents. Because oftentimes I think everyone has things they can become good at. They're different things, and the more people can use their knowledge, the better it is. And I also think it will be better for those people because they will have more purpose in their life. They will understand that they're doing something meaningful. So I think it's both beneficial for economy and for those people who it will affect. So yeah.
Thank you very much. But someone else would like to share their opinions, their perspectives, their wishes for the future?
And Maria, maybe you can also say in in Ukrainian, pardon me, and I know Gennady is as well. And thank you, Gennady, because you're doing an amazing job and I appreciate. But Maria, could you also say for everyone that if anyone wishes to speak in Ukrainian, please feel free to. It doesn't need to be in English.
Так, звичайно, Кай хоче наголосити на тому, що якщо комусь зручніше задати питання чи якийсь коментар українською або російською мовою, будь-якою, будь ласка, не соромтесь, ви можете себе роз-unmute, як то кажуть, на англійській мові і просто поділитися своїми враженнями. Можливо, у вас є якась інша думка, яка стосується саме бачення того, яка Україна має бути в майбутньому. Ми багато почули про місце для української єдності, про те, що має бути якась ідея, яка об'єднає нас усіх, але, можливо, є якісь ще думки або коментарі.
I sound much better in Ukrainian.
Yeah, I see. Next time you'll speak in Ukrainian, Kai, I'm sure.
Step by step. Okay, I know it's already very late for many. So if no one has anything else they wish to share at this moment, Maria, there were a few points raised already. Do you want to share any reflections on them?
Yeah, I think I'll share one last from my side. I know the moment when the war will be over, most of the people who are right now abroad, most of the people who are IDPs will pack the bags and we will go back to Ukraine. I know this is our identity. In our identity is love for the country, love for our people, and love for our land. And many of those who are right now abroad, and I'm personally myself also abroad, I'm a refugee with my son, and I took him out of Kyiv only because a rocket hit the building next to ours, and the school was really impacted, and it was not safe for us to be there, but I go to Ukraine quite often, back and forth. And I know that most of the people will go back as well. So this talks a lot about our resilience, a lot about our solidarity, but also our love for our home country and our land. So that's the answer to many questions. What will happen next? It doesn't matter what will happen next. We will keep our levels of resilience and solidarity, no matter what is happening around us. So thank you so much for your participation today. And on behalf of Ukrainians and Patria, I'm really grateful for the comments, for the questions, but also for the interest and to keep raise awareness about what is happening in my home country.
Thank you, Maria. Kai, I welcome you to bring up your perspective as well.
Thanks, Sarah. I was going to say, if it's okay, I want to share a slightly different perspective than Maria with a lot of profound love and appreciation and respect for what Maria said. And what I want to say, and my apologies for how I will say this, it's okay to be pissed off. It's okay to be tired. It's okay to just not want to deal with the shit anymore. It's okay to be angry at the government in Russia for its invasion and the war. It's okay to be angry at your own government for what it has done, sometimes during and before the war. There have been great things that have been done and a lot of heroism, and there's been a lot of bad things done as well. It's okay to not have to be a hero every moment. And it's wonderful for everyone who wants to step up and get involved. And it's okay for those who don't as well. I just want to really respect what was said about inclusive before. because you're going to have people come back and people who are there in so many different spaces and states of mind. And what I said in the beginning, there isn't one experience of the war, there's millions. And it's really important to let people have the space for whatever they need. I appreciate what was said in terms of this idea of we don't unite if we don't have an enemy. I think we really need to get beyond, I almost wanted to speak a bit too strongly. I was going to say we need to get beyond the bullshit idea of nation from antiquated and irrelevant past. Ukraine and any country, they're all things that were made up at one time or another. Countries have existed for a very short period on this planet. And they can have beautiful things. But it's beautiful most of all when it creates the space for its citizens. When every citizen can feel respected. When every citizen can feel safe. And that's when you get people feeling a true sense of belonging. There's a rise at the moment in a war of us versus them. And that can break after. And you can have a lot of competing voices. You're going to have people who just want to get back to life. You're going to have people who fought on the front line and want to get back to life. You'll have people who fought on the front line and believe their voice should be heard loudest because of their sacrifices for the country. And you can have dangerous internal dynamics after as well, especially if you promote things like Putin's agenda, where you say Ukraine is for Ukrainians and Ukrainian is the language of Ukrainians. Then you're basically a little Putin. That's what Putin said. That was his justification for the war. The idea of an ethno-nationalist Ukraine that he was responding to. The worst possible thing is to become what your enemy calls you and to be their cheerleader for their message. Ukraine is a people of many countries, of many cultures, many languages, and that diversity is one of the things that makes it so beautiful. And one of you spoke about being inclusive. So here's a question. What's your vision for Ukraine? Do you want a future where people can live and be safe, where people can be respected, where people can have good jobs, where you can trust your government and have less corruption? These are things you have rights to as citizens. And I think it matters to bring forward that vision, because while there's been a lot that has been powerful and positive and inspiring, those pictures of the children with their uniforms and weapons, it's something you should grasp. It's not huge, but it's a part, it's there. And any war can create the toxic cancer that can affect an own society when the war defines and shapes your future. And I really want to respect what was said. I think, Clifford, if you said it, this idea also of rest. One of the things I would love for us to do as the Romanian Peace Institute, so your neighbor and ally, is to create programs so that people from Ukraine can come here and rest. Youth, aid workers, doctors, because I think also people just need a space to breathe, and to different places in Ukraine as well. Lastly, I really want to thank Heike Brunken and Martina Musa, who were doing research and support for preparing for today's event. I want to really thank Gennady, because some people may have spoken too much and too quickly, and that can be hard to translate. And I just want to share something that I've learned over 25 years and that has been shared with others. They say often that if you fight a war for 1, 2, 5, 10 years, it takes 10, 20, 30 years to heal and recover. So it's important to know that this is a long-term journey. It's not just about when the guns stop. It's an effort that will continue. But in that journey, you can make the choice to not only be deciding how to heal and recover from the war, but how to live. Дякую.
Дякую. Please. Oh. I think people are not speaking, they're clapping, which is a very good indicator. I want to thank the speakers very much. And if any of the other participants don't want to add anything to what was said, then we can also take the idea of rest that was shared and 20 minutes earlier. It was great to have you here at this event, and we'll be doing many more initiatives like this to be able to talk to each other for this year. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Laura, for your facilitation and moderation of the event. Really grateful for your contribution.
Thank you, Maria.
Thank you.
Goodbye, everyone.